From the 8th to the 5th centuries BC, Sparta was the envy of ancient Greece, a collection of several hundred often combative city-states.
Most Greeks admired the Spartans and feared them. They did not find it very comforting when a Spartan army, even a small one, arrived anywhere near their territory because of the reputation the Spartans had as soldiers.
The mere sight of the Spartan war machine sent many foes running for the hills. When battles were fought, they routinely involved small numbers and lasted only a matter of days. However, early in the 5th century BC, all that changed with a massive invasion from the east. Persia, a vast empire hungry to expand, steamrolled into Greece with a colossal army some 200,000 strong. But the Greeks, led by Sparta, gamely rose to the challenge. In 480 BC, 300 Spartan soldiers made an immortal stand at Thermopylae, inspiring a nation and tipping the balance of war. Then, 1 year later, on the fields of Plataea, the Spartans crushed the Persian infantry in one of the bloodiest days in history. General Pausanias and the legendary Spartan warriors under his command were hailed as heroes. Still, as the few surviving Persian troops limped home, the Greeks could only wonder, when would they fight again?
They hadn't destroyed Persian power, they hadn't destroyed the Persian Empire, they hadn't taken away the Persian money, the vast troops that they had. So any sensible Greek would have had to consider the possibility that there would be more trouble from the Persians.
The Greeks, who rarely agreed on anything, had created a shaky alliance to take on the Persians, one they managed to preserve under the leadership of Pausanias. But in 477 BC, Pausanias was replaced by an Athenian. Sparta was happy to step down as head of the Greek alliance and return to its role as hegemon, or leader of the Peloponnesian League, a loosely aligned confederation of city-states in southern Greece.
The Spartans seem absolutely bound and determined to retreat from any kind of global role. They just basically seem to see their only real future as Peloponnesian-based, as going back, running their league, and that's that.
Then there were the Messenians. Sparta had conquered Messenia some 200 years earlier and created a class of agricultural serfs called helots. But the helots outnumbered the Spartans by as much as 10 to 1, and rebellion was a way of life. Meanwhile, Sparta and Athens remained on good terms, despite a checkered past.
The number one politician in Athens was Cimon, who was friend of the Spartans beyond all belief. The Spartans trusted Cimon, therefore they didn't worry too much about the Athenians. Everything was going pretty well.
Cimon had great respect for the Spartans and their unwavering commitment to discipline and obedience. But fellow Athenian aristocrats who ruled the city did not think Sparta could be counted on if the Persians attacked again.
The perception emerged that Sparta was a great threat. Likewise, the Spartans from early on felt that Athens now threatened them, threatened their dependencies and their allies abroad.
So Athens began building its own formidable alliance, named the Delian League, after the sacred island of Delos, where the League's treasury was kept. Members included city-states to the north, most of the Aegean islands, and the city-states on the western coast of Asia Minor, formerly under Persian control. Athens demanded loyalty from its allies and payment of a heavy tribute to supply and maintain the navy.
The League had to compel some states who didn't want to join, on the grounds that you couldn't be a free rider. We were bringing you freedom from Persia, we were preserving freedom of the seas that could allow you to get rich. You have to contribute.
The Athenian navy's relentless patrol of Greek waters succeeded in eliminating the Persian threat. Almost immediately, several members of the Delian League wanted out.
the Athenians and the other allies reacted the way Lincoln and the North did when the South felt that would be a good idea and said, no, you don't, and they used force to suppress those rebellions. So gradually, the Athenian navy got stronger, the allies got weaker, and this was turning into an Athenian empire.
In fact, by 465 BC, the Athenians rivaled the Spartans in muscle and influence. With its commanding naval presence, Athens ruled the seas, while Sparta's celebrated army was unbeatable on land. Two power blocks with two very different ideologies. Sparta demanded that the city-states in the Peloponnesian League establish oligarchies ruled by a privileged few. Delian League members were expected to embrace democracy. The two Greek giants were on a collision course for war when the unexpected happened.
There is an earthquake that erupts in Spartan territory, kills a large number of Spartans. The Helots of Messenia take advantage of this natural disaster to rise up in rebellion.
More than 1,000 Spartan men died in the earthquake, leaving only 9,000 hoplites to quell the uprising. Desperate, they turned to their friend Cimon for help. At great personal risk, he managed to convince a reluctant Athenian assembly to commit troops to Sparta.
The Athenians send down a large army, a land army, ready to help the Spartans against their Helots. The Athenians show up, and the Spartans say, gee, we've changed our minds.
And the Spartans then respond in this really extraordinary way with this terrific insult of sending that army packing, of sending them back home. And why they did this is because they were terrified and scandalized by what they saw. They saw these democratic Athenians walking around in an open and free way, and these Athenians asking, hey, how come you guys have enslaved the Helots? Don't you know you're not supposed to enslave other Greeks?
And this really is the moment in which it's pretty clear that the two sides are not going to be friendly.
The humiliating rejection by the Spartans outraged the Athenian assembly, further reducing the influence of old-line aristocrats. Cimon was made the scapegoat and ostracized from Athens for 10 years as punishment. Back in Sparta, the Messenian revolt raged on for another 2 years. Finally, in 462 BC, the Helots were contained. But more trouble was brewing to the north, where Athens continued its rapid expansionism by concluding alliances with Thessaly and Argos.
That must have terrified the Spartans. Their ancient Argive rivals are now democrats. So the Spartans were worried in two ways about democracy. One was what it might do to their own society if that notion crept in, and two, how it might hurt their foreign relations because democracies were likely to join with democracies.
In 459 BC, Athens and Sparta finally came to blows. However, the so-called First Peloponnesian War quickly turned into nothing more than a series of raids and counter-raids on opposing allies.
Sometimes it's a hot war, and there are actually military battles that are fought. Sometimes it's a cold war, and there's simply skirmishes on both sides. It's never fought totally.
Meanwhile, leadership shifted from Cimon to a wealthy Athenian named Pericles. Pericles was born into politics, and he would be a dominant force in Athens for the next 30 years. One of Pericles' pivotal gambits was to take over the Delian League's treasury, which had been originally under the control of the allies.
In the middle of the 5th century, the Athenians moved this treasury from Delos back to Athens. And that was the crucial moment, I think, that when we saw that the Athenians were really taking charge.
Suddenly, flush with wealth, Pericles embarked on a public building program, the scale, cost, and magnificence of which had never before been seen. And so began the great flowering of Athenian culture, known as the Golden Age. In a sweeping, spare-no-expense building program, Pericles first had the long walls from the city to the port of Piraeus completed, a move designed to withstand any future siege. Athens soon became an island of invincible fortification, importing food and supplies from Crimea and Egypt, her powerful navy poised to repel any Spartan attempt to threaten supply lines.
It's a commercial centre as well as a naval, military centre. So the Athenians had, so long as they controlled Piraeus and the access to it, they were pretty much secure from their grain supply being interrupted.
Pericles also ordered work to begin on the temple complex atop the Acropolis, destroyed 30 years earlier by the marauding Persian army.
Much of the optimism of Athenian culture in the 5th century comes from the victory over the Persians, which is the classical period of Greek culture, the period of heroic sculpture, of the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, of the comedies of Aristophanes, of the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides.
The brilliant philosophers Socrates and Plato were also products of the time. But perhaps the most spectacular achievement of all was the Parthenon, or House of the Virgin Goddess. Housed inside this magnificent marble structure was a giant ivory and gold sculpture of Athena, believed to be the divine champion of Athenian military power. If built today, the Parthenon would cost over $500 million, and it has endured as the masterpiece of Greek architecture. Under the astute leadership of Pericles, Athens became the center of intellectual and cultural life in the Aegean. A glittering city of some 60,000 citizens, it stood in stark contrast to grim Sparta, where the mounting influence of its neighbor to the northeast was cause for great alarm.
I think the Spartans, when they see Athens as a rising power, the first thing they think is kill it, swat it, destroy it. We can't have rising powers. We can't have competitors.
And so, by the middle of the 5th century BC, Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states in Greece, were on the verge of full-scale war. By 450 BC, the balance of power had shifted from Sparta to Athens, where the Golden Age blossomed in all its splendor. In Sparta, however, this display of extravagance was greeted with fear and suspicion. More and more, the Spartans were feeling threatened by Athens' growing power.
The Spartans are always very arrogant people, and for the Spartans, it's really important to be able to thrust their chest out and say, I'm number one, I'm top dog, and nobody else is top dog.
To hammer home that point, the Spartan army invaded Attica in 446 BC, and shortly after, the Athenians offered a truce. The 30 years' peace was agreed upon by both sides the next year, and with it, the First Peloponnesian War ended. Sparta was content to turn inward, much as the United States did following World War I. However, over the next 10 years, the Athenians continued to interfere with the members of the Peloponnesian League, practically baiting Sparta out of its isolationism.
Athens went all over the place, up in Macedonia and Thrace and in the Aegean islands, and crushed smaller cities and settlements that were friendly to Sparta. This was naturally perceived by the Spartans as the first but unmistakable steps of marching against Sparta itself.
The Corinthians, really one of Sparta's most important allies, are absolutely convinced that Athens intends to break the Peloponnesian League to become the imperial hegemon of the entire Aegean. But the Spartans constantly pull back. They're not eager to take on these Athenians. It's not going to be an easy war. They're clear on that. The Athenians have a navy that they can't imagine confronting. Sparta simply doesn't have an effective navy to respond with.
Building and manning a formidable navy took vast amounts of capital, and the Spartans had long rejected any form of money, believing it led to inequality at home and needless temptations from the outside.
They don't even have coinage of their own. So a fleet of 200 ships has 40,000 men apart from Marines, that is to say from hoplites who serve with the fleet. That's a lot of human beings to be fed. The Athenians have a system for raising that money in order to support the fleet. The Spartans have nothing of the sort.
And so Sparta remained defiant, refusing to be dragged into war. But the Spartans were forced to listen when the members of the Peloponnesian League called an emergency meeting in 432 BC. Many cities denounced Athens to the allies assembled at Sparta. By doing nothing, they said, the Spartans were encouraging the Athenians to commit further acts of aggression.
Therefore, discontent, distrust arose along with the sentiment that this could be settled only by war and not through peaceful negotiations.
Sparta's stated aim in ending the 30 Years' peace was to liberate Greece by restoring autonomy to Greek states subject to Athens. The Spartan strategy was simple: march on Attica and engage the Athenians in a land battle.
And so they mobilized probably the biggest single army that the Peloponnesian League has ever fielded. It may have been 50 to 60,000 men. And in late spring of 431, they marched northward through the isthmus up to the Megarian plain, and they go into the plain of Attica.
This was the infamous Spartan war machine that enemies so feared, and Pericles was determined to avoid a head-to-head battle. Instead, he came up with a two-pronged strategy: offense by sea, defense by land. At sea, the Athenian navy set sail with 100 warships called triremes. Their mission? To conduct covert raids on the Peloponnesus. On land, Pericles' plan was more controversial. In fact, it was a totally unconventional approach to war.
Pericles' strategy was this. It was to avoid, at all costs, the standard way of fighting a war. A battle between hoplites of one side against hoplites of the other.
Pericles decides to evacuate the 200,000 acres of Attica and send its population of farmers with their families, perhaps over 100,000 altogether, inside the walls of Athens, and to ride out these invasions on the premise that Athens can be supplied by sea.
We've got a secure port. We've got massive walls around our city. We can import all the food we want. We can keep control of our empire.
They could do that because they could collect money from their imperial empire. They could maintain a fleet. They could rule the seas. It was all perfect.
Spartan has no tradition of siegecraft, so they're not going to be able to breach the walls of Athens. But they have this tradition of Greek warfare that you march into an enemy's sacred land. It's an affront to their masculinity, it's an affront to their sovereignty, it's an affront to their national pride, and you hack away a few olive trees, you burn a few acres of grain, and the enraged farmers in their frenzy come out to meet you on a plain, and then you wipe them out, and the issue is settled.
But the Athenians refused to budge. Instead, they remained barricaded inside the city, further protected by separate walls, including the long walls that extended nearly 5 miles to the harbor at Piraeus.
The Spartans are pretty much bamboozled by this. This isn't good. And this basically leaves the Spartans with no response. The Spartan system was based on when we move into your territory, you move out, and we chop you to ribbons.
Frustrated, the Spartans continued to pillage the fields of Attica, an area the size of Rhode Island. But Sparta was ill-equipped to resupply such a massive army. So, waiting for the Athenians to come out and fight was simply not an option. 1 month after their arrival, the despondent troops packed up and headed for home.
The first year, Pericles seems a genius, but he didn't count on the idea that a city that was designed to house perhaps 75 to 125,000 inhabitants was ill-equipped in the summer months to house 250 or 300,000 inhabitants. It doesn't have the sewage facilities, it doesn't have the water facilities, it doesn't have the housing.
Pericles' biggest miscalculation, however, had nothing to do with sanitation or overcrowding.
Where he went wrong was in underestimating the effect on morale of being in effect cowardly, going behind your walls, seeing the Spartans come and doing nothing. That went against the grain of the Greek code of hoplite morality.
When the Spartans marched on Attica the following summer, Pericles' strategy was clearly under fire. Yet no one could possibly have foreseen what would happen next.
Athens was hit by a terrible plague, which wiped out something like a third of the population in Athens. Think about what that would mean. Translate that into American terms. I mean, you're talking about what, 90 million people?
The deadly disease, probably brought aboard a grain ship from Egypt, turned the streets of Athens into corridors of horror. The city was littered with dying men. Young and old, rich and poor fell victim. The plague played no favorites.
The effect of the plague was to cast Athens, and consequently its army and navy, into a state of disarray.
And suddenly, the Athenian game plan doesn't look great. It also kills Athens' leader, Pericles, and suddenly the man with the plan is no longer around to pursue it.
The death of Pericles left Athens prey to hostile factions and reckless leaders. But what also died was even more profound: his extraordinary vision.
And that caused extreme problems for the Athenians because there was no obvious succession to him. He hadn't planned one, and it was a democratic city. There was no government, and the individuals who each thought they ought to be the successor had rather different views, and they lacked the authority of Pericles. So Athens was in a difficult position.
In addition to the devastating losses, the plague also inflicted enormous psychological damage on the Athenians. Their faith in the gods was rattled, their self-confidence severely shaken.
And in the aftermath of this, they sue for peace. The Spartans think they're going to win, and they turn down the peace offer, and the war goes on.
The Athenians all of a sudden have become wimps, is the way it would have looked to the Spartans. They won't come out and fight us. They've never done that before. And therefore, it's terrible for us to make peace, I think the Spartans must have said, with people who don't even have the guts to come out and fight.
They broke their back for the moment, but the Athenians are kind of like the Americans. They're tremendously resilient people.
And so, Athens assembled 250 triremes, making it the largest naval deployment of the war. Following a revolt on the island of Lesbos, they made use of this force and blocked the harbors of Mytilene. The next year, 427 BC, Athenian general Nicias led Athens to victory at Minoa. The Spartans countered with a decisive win at Plataea. And so went the Peloponnesian War, from city to port to island, all over the Aegean. Strike and counterstrike, revolt and forced submission.
And so both Athens and Sparta, in the first few years of the war, are really in pretty desperate straits. Neither of them really has a way to win this thing.
Despite their resolve, the Athenians especially felt the chilling effects of war. Their population was devastated, their land ravaged, and their treasury nearly exhausted. Still, as the campaign season of 425 approached, Athens valiantly prepared for battle. That summer at Pylos, on the western shores of Greece, the Athenians forced the unprecedented surrender of 120 Spartan equals. Shattered forever was the carefully cultivated myth that neither force nor famine could make the Spartans give up their arms.
The Spartans were so upset at this loss of Spartan manpower, and also, by the way, nobody could believe that Spartans ever surrendered. It was inconceivable. It never happened before, so that they just wanted to wipe this whole thing out, but they also didn't want these men to be killed. It was these hostages that finally compelled the Spartans to make peace.
But on what terms? After 6 grueling years of fighting, no useful result could be claimed by either side. Sparta was unable to liberate Greece from the grip of the Athenian Empire, while Athens had failed in its quest for absolute security, the very reason Pericles risked war in the first place. The expenditure of lives, suffering, and money, it seemed, was all in vain. Eventually, an uneasy peace would be brokered, then shattered, thanks to one of history's most colorful and unpredictable characters. The humiliating surrender of the Spartans at Pylos in 425 BC completely altered the course of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta, with 120 hoplites imprisoned in Athens, had no choice but to seek peace, under terms extremely favorable to Athens. For the Athenians, this was one victory to be savored.
Spartans would never have come to this, no matter what happened to them, if something like that hadn't taken place.
All Greece resounded from the shock. Spartan soldiers had laid down their weapons and surrendered.
Sparta and Athens once again came to the table, but this time the political climate favored peace.
Both sides had very powerful reasons for wanting to make peace. The Athenians had lost Amphipolis in the north, a major city, and with access to timber, trade routes, and generally that whole part of the empire was therefore slightly destabilized. The Spartans had lost a significant number of individuals, captured in 425, held prisoner as hostage in Athens.
However, peace was elusive, and hostilities began to breed again. As the two sides drifted back towards war, Sparta threatened to fortify a post in Attica. With 120 Spartan soldiers still in captivity, it was risky. But the dangerous bluff worked, and Athens agreed to terms. The articles of the treaty, called the Peace of Nicias, were meant to be binding for 50 years. The fighting stopped, and the disgraced Spartan prisoners were finally set free.
Theoretically, both sides laid down their arms, but it was kind of like a peace between Russia and the United States. It was a Cold War.
Immediately there were problems. Several of Sparta's allies refused to accept the peace treaty, including Boeotia, Megara, and Corinth.
Peace of Nicias had to be consolidated by a separate agreement between Athens and Sparta, and that was in a way its undoing, because the other allies of Sparta and some of the allies of Athens thought, what are Sparta and Athens up to? What do they know that we don't? And there were particular outstanding grievances on both sides.
Meanwhile, in Athens, a leader emerged, a man who loved to mock authority and rile the conservatives. A man who would prove to be one of the most flamboyant characters in history. His name, Alcibiades.
Something of a tremendously ambitious guy, something like a JFK plus General Patton, sort of a forerunner of Alexander the Great, in that he came from an extremely wealthy family, had tremendous ambition, great war hero, student of Socrates, etc., etc.
His father died when he was young, and he was a ward of Pericles, raised by Pericles in the great man's house. And I think that's a critical thing. You don't have to be Dr. Freud to see the influence here. For the rest of his life, he tried to be greater than Pericles, because that's the kind of personality that he had, which was mighty tough.
He is loved by men, he is loved by women. He's clearly the most charming and most exciting man of his time, and he's a chameleon.
Alcibiades was also unscrupulous and fabulously persuasive. He quickly forged alliances with some key Peloponnesian city-states, including Elis, Mantinea, and Argos. Predictably, this forced a confrontation with Sparta, and the uneasy peace of Nicias began to unravel.
Meanwhile, the Argives are putting together an independent league of democracies in the Peloponnesus who want to fight Sparta, and Athens joins them, and there's this enormously important day in the history of the Greek world, in the history of democracy, that nobody knows about. It is the day of the Battle of Mantinea, which takes place in the year 418.
Located right in Sparta's backyard, Mantinea was a battle that had to be won. But the Spartans quickly found themselves outflanked by the enemy. Facing certain defeat, the Spartans broke from their patented phalanx, defying their commanding king's orders. It was a gutsy move that ran counter to everything they had been taught since childhood.
Spartans were very lucky that day because the officers who were told, you move from here to there, said, hell we will. They refused and later on were punished for it. And that allowed the Spartans to take the battle. If they had lost, I do believe that would have been the end of Sparta as the state we're talking about.
Argos immediately renounced its alliance with Athens and joined the Spartans. Remarkably, Alcibiades came out relatively unscathed, and over the next 2 years he cooked up a convoluted scheme. It was here at this podium where he laid out his plan to the assembly.
Alcibiades' plan is lunatic. He wants to eventually empty the city of Athens, get a fleet. The final tally will be 200 ships, 40,000 men will sail 800 miles away and ostensibly attack a democracy that's bigger than themselves and is an ally of Sparta.
The target was Syracuse, located on the island of Sicily, an area of rich arable farmland and vast mineral resources. Nicias was adamantly opposed to the plan, but he was no match for the charming Alcibiades.
I compared Alcibiades with Bill Clinton, and I compared Nicias with Bob Dole. That is to say, a man too cautious and too conservative, a Spartan at Athens, whereas Alcibiades was the most Athenian of the Athenians, the most bold of the bold. And he took enormous pleasure in his capacity to outwit people.
Nicias argued that it was imprudent to attack Sicily with so many troubles at home. But when the votes favored Alcibiades, Nicias was forced into a risky gamble.
He says, look, Sicily's big and strong. We need a fantastic force if we're going to do it. And so his hope is that the Athenians will be scared off at the high cost of this and they'll stop. Well, instead, some wise guy, politician pops up, he says, yeah, like what?
Nicias quickly realized his ploy had backfired, but it was too late. Athens, fueled by the fiery rhetoric of Alcibiades, was consumed by a lust for war.
And they finally pass everything that he asked for. And they turn it into a monstrous expedition, which the negative bottom line is, if you lose that, you're probably finished.
Alcibiades, however, saw it as a call to brilliance. He was thinking honor and glory, not defeat. But in a city rife with envy, his every move was suspect.
Just before the grand fleet is supposed to go off, a really nasty business happens. Various statues of the god Hermes are defaced all of a sudden all over the city all at once.
So the bottom line was a kind of a McCarthyism, a siege of McCarthyism happened in Athens, where people were arrested by the hundreds. Innocent people were turning stool pigeon, turning in their friends. They did it, he did it.
Enemies of Alcibiades spread rumors that he was to blame. So Alcibiades faced the serious charge of sacrilege. Outraged, he demanded a trial without delay while his popularity was at a peak. However, his accusers conspired to postpone the arraignment. They would try Alcibiades in absentia, after the Armada set sail for Sicily. It would prove to be a decision with catastrophic consequences. In 415 BC, the Athenians prepared to launch an awesome armada of warships for the 800-mile voyage from Athens to Sicily. Under the dual command of Alcibiades and Nicias, the most costly force ever assembled was eager to conquer a land of abundant riches and eager to bring Sparta to its knees. But Alcibiades was operating under a veil of suspicion, accused of committing unspeakable acts against the god Hermes.
And so off sails a great fleet. But shortly thereafter, the Commission of Inquiry into Alcibiades and his nefarious activities turns up a guilty verdict, and an envoy is sent to recall Alcibiades to come back to Athens to face punishment.
The result of that recall is that Alcibiades has no intention of going back and placing his life in the hands of the Athenian assembly, which he knows is equal to a death sentence.
A victim of his own glory, Alcibiades chose to escape rather than face the judgment that awaited him. But only a man with the swagger of Alcibiades would dare try his next move.
He goes to Sparta. And now we have Alcibiades in Sparta. They accept him, of course, because he's a renegade Athenian who knows a lot and could be helpful to them.
And that was when everything kind of really got crazy, because Alcibiades, who had been in Athens, the supreme Athenian, dressing well, wearing his hair long, having wild symposiums, parties, things like this, now in Sparta immediately became more Spartan than the Spartans. He wore the simple plain cloak, he exercised, he trained at the gym, and everyone fell in love with him.
Alcibiades brought a sense of vision and audacity to the reserved Spartans. Meanwhile, at Syracuse, Nicias was in charge of an expedition he never wanted to launch in the first place.
And poor Nicias, besides not wanting to fight in Sicily and being a very conservative, cautious leader, superstitious, is also suffering from kidney stones. So he's in poor health.
Despite lackluster leadership, the vast Athenian navy simply overpowered the Sicilians. On the ground, Athenian wall builders tried to systematically cut off enemy supply lines. Syracuse, once a pleasing mix of temples and promenades, was soon in ruins, her troops a study in disorder and insubordination. With the city about to fall, Syracusan envoys were dispatched to Sparta to persuade them to help. Alcibiades convinced the reluctant Spartans they had to act at once. The Athenians, he revealed, would not rest until they ruled the West, including the Peloponnesus.
The Spartans send one man, a man named Gylippus, to put steel into the hearts of the Syracusans.
Unlike most Spartan generals, known for their cautious and conservative demeanor, Gylippus served with uncommon bravado. Gylippus set sail with only 4 ships and a small contingent of marines, but they were a welcome sight to the outmanned Sicilians.
And so the Syracusans both get a genuine military expert, someone who really knows how to get things done, and they also get somebody that they really trust.
Immediately after Gylippus arrived in Syracuse, a counterwall was constructed to intersect the Athenian lines. Then, over the next 12 months, Gylippus refashioned the army and navy to reflect Spartan discipline and order.
And he just whipped the Sicilians into shape, just turned them into crack troops, little by little by little, instituted certain things. He instituted the common messes, and Sicilians and Spartans were Dorians. They were ethnically related, so they had certain common societal structures, and he exploited these things, and he turned them over a period of a year into crack troops, and they defeated the Athenians in an incredible battle in the great harbor of Syracuse, where the Syracusans had a wall of ships across the mouth of the harbor.
At day's end, most of the Athenian fleet was destroyed by the Spartan-led Sicilians. Casualties were massive, the sea becoming a carpet of dead and dying bodies. Faced with certain death, the surviving Athenians fled, but soon became bogged down in swampy terrain where they were slaughtered almost to the man.
The whole debacle will end in the Asinarius River, where the Athenians are drinking mud and blood and fighting each other to have it.
They're just cut to shreds by the Syracusan cavalry and the Syracusan land forces, infantry forces. It is a catastrophe the likes of which the Athenians had never suffered, never even imagined suffering.
In the wake of the humiliating defeat, Nicias surrendered. He was eventually executed. The 2-year siege of Sicily had indeed been a disaster.
This was different. It was not like being defeated by the Spartans on Greek territory, but rather it was being defeated away from home in a way that was visible to the entire Hellenic world, both in Greece and abroad in the many influential colonies.
However, things were very different in Sparta. Gylippus returned home to a hero's welcome, while Alcibiades tightened the noose on his former city-state. He advised Spartan commanders to establish a permanent encampment at Decelea, within sight of the walls of Athens. In 413 BC, a garrison was installed, enabling Spartan troops to conduct their scorched earth policy year-round. Athens was forced to rely mostly on imported food, but with a much reduced navy to keep its port open and free.
Everybody in the Greek world thought it was over. And there's a general uprising in the Athenian Empire as many, many states rebel.
Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, moved in for the kill. First, he encouraged the Persian governor, Tissaphernes, to fund Sparta's war effort. Then Alcibiades snatched several territories from under the control of Athens. But all the while he was up to his old tricks, consorting with none other than the Spartan king's wife, Timea.
Alcibiades is a man who could simply never let well enough alone. He engaged in intrigues in Sparta, which won him some real enemies. Those enemies sent word to the king of Sparta, in command at the garrison at Decelea, that the king's wife was due to have a baby.
When King Agis counted up the months since he'd last seen his wife, the numbers just didn't work.
The enemies of Alcibiades immediately point the finger and say, and you know who the real father is.
I would imagine King Agis wasn't too happy about this, and Alcibiades had to kind of hot-foot it out of there, one jump ahead of the hangman.
And so now, having turned his coat and gone to Sparta, he now does it again, but he can't go to Athens. He's an outlaw in Athens with a price on his head. Any Spartan gets hold of him is going to kill him. Only one place to go, Persia.
And so the chameleon known as Alcibiades, condemned to death in both Athens and Sparta, changed colors again.
What sort of a character can go from one defecting from his own people to their arch enemy, then defect to another enemy? What kind of a person can do that?
Fate, it seems, wasn't done with Alcibiades, and neither were the Spartans. The audacious general had another trick up his sleeve, a bold maneuver even by his standards. But would it work? For more than 300 years, just the sight of a wall of scarlet cloaks and bronze shields was enough to force Sparta's adversaries to simply give up and run away. What was at the heart of this great society that allows it to prevail even when vastly outnumbered? To attempt to get a glimpse into the mind of the Spartan warrior, one can turn to some of the last vestiges of Spartan society, their poetry.
The significance of Tertius's poetry to the Spartans was great because he was a powerful poet. He raised the morale of the Spartans through his poetry. He became, in a way, the voice of Sparta.
It is shocking when an old man lies on the front line, an old warrior whose head is white and beard gray, exhaling his strong soul into the dust. An abominable vision, foul to see. But in a young man, all is beautiful when he still possesses the shining flower of lovely youth. Alive, he is adored by men, desired by women, and finest to look upon when he falls dead in the forward clash. Let each man spread his legs, rooting them in the ground, bite his teeth into his lips, and hold. This was the Spartan mindset that allowed a small, vastly outnumbered Greek city-state to enslave 250,000 people, strong-arm hostile neighbors into forming powerful alliances, and defeat the million-man Persian army. Now, near the end of the 5th century BC, Sparta was embroiled in the Peloponnesian War, fighting for control of its most powerful neighbor, the Athenian Empire. And for the first time in their history, Sparta was on the ropes.
Earlier battles had created heroes and created heroic values, But the Peloponnesian War destroyed heroes and destroyed these values. Cities were besieged, hostages were slaughtered, innocent people were butchered. It was the first modern war where the old niceties were ignored.
In order for Sparta to prevail in this new kind of war, they needed a larger, more powerful navy. In order to get that navy, Sparta needed something that it had never had before: money. For funding, the fledgling Spartan fleet turned to the only power that despised Athens more than Sparta did: Persia. Persia considers an alliance, but is dissuaded by its newest tactical advisor. He is none other than Alcibiades, the same man who had been Sparta's staunchest supporter for the previous 2 years.
He's always pushing the envelope. He is always doing that which is forbidden. And he's the kind of man who likes to sort of do a little dance around his own capacity to get away with what other human beings can't get away with.
With the ear of Tissaphernes, the Persian governor of Asia Minor, Alcibiades, the legendary Athenian turned Spartan, was now on his third side of a two-sided war.
Alcibiades has persuaded Tissaphernes that really what he should do is wear out both the Spartans and the Greeks by not giving the Spartans sufficient support. Let you and him fight, was the policy. A very clever policy for Persia.
However, the Spartans were able to collect funds from various interested governments and individuals in order to build their new navy. Meanwhile, Alcibiades continued to display some loyalty to Athens, and as a result was no longer trusted by Tissaphernes. Fearing arrest, Alcibiades left Persia, but only to rekindle his influence in Greece.
Alcibiades is staggeringly talented. He is a man who has got a brilliant education. He is charismatic. He's spectacularly wealthy. Everything he touches turns to gold, or at least for a while.